Good afternoon, buenas tardes, boa tarde, salut. My name is Gabriela Noles Cotito, she, her pronouns. I am currently in the third year of the Africana Studies PhD program, and I have the honor of introducing this amazing event. The Africana Studies Graduate Student Colloquium at the University of Pennsylvania is an event planned by the PhD students in the Africana Studies department with the support of the administrative champions and professors of our department, to whom we are always grateful. This event has been running since 2013 as an opportunity for the African Studies Department's doctoral students to engage with leading scholars around central debates and questions in the field of African studies. In this sense, previous topics has been African studies and transdisciplinarity, questions in methods and discourse in 2014, allies, archives, and activism in the academy in 2015, subversive voices, the Black body across the African diaspora in 2016, and routes to freedom beyond elsewhereisms and the academy last year. The organizing committee for this year's endeavor are Bonnie Maldonado, she, her pronouns, second-year PhD student in Africana Studies, Crystal Moore, she, her pronouns, third-year PhD student in Africana Studies, and myself. For this year's colloquium, in its 9th virtual and pandemic edition for the second year in a row, we took into consideration many factors: the current sociopolitical context, locally and internationally, the challenges and also the clarity that the pandemic has brought us, the possibilities and limitations that manifest through our ongoing practices in collective struggle and liberation, and the event being on Women's History Month. In choosing this year's topic, Black Women and Rebellious Archival Acts, we selected a theme that allows us, PhD students, scholars, and participants at large, to reimagine and rearticulate how we engage with and in archives. Often highlighting the stories of those in power, archival materials often render Black women and their experiences non-existent, and yet they were and are there. Current scholars in African studies are actively gathering the threads of their stories while creating new methods to highlight Black women's acts of resistance and rebellion and how to disentangle both. All in all, the initiatives of our discipline, which we practice in Africana at Penn, are to describe, correct, and prescribe. For this, we focus on the noise, but also on the silences, and lean into those. And although we are leaning into the silences, using Professor Holden's words, our writing is loud. Now, as for the format of today's session, we will introduce our amazing panelists who will answer some general questions. After this, we will ask questions about their work that we expect can generate a conversation amongst them. We will conclude with a Q&A of 30 minutes and 5 more minutes for closing remarks. On behalf of the 9th Africana Studies Graduate Colloquium organizing team, it is my duty to extend our gratitude first to our ancestors, the ones we know and the unknown and silenced ones. We, as junior scholars, stand on their shoulders and embody their wildest dreams. Thank you also to Dr. Williams and our graduate chair for her constant advice and check-ins. A big shout out to Ms. Carol Davis for all her support, always. Our gratitude also goes to Sean Fields, Africana Technology and Design Officer. Thank you to the public for attending this colloquium, and thank you to our panelists, without whom we could not have this event. Now, before passing the mic to Crystal, I would like to touch base with you all on some recommendations for the best enjoyment of this event. We know that we like to exercise our reactions through physical expressions. So we ask you to engage with your comments and reactions through Zoom, through the Zoom chat function, and offer your questions within the Q&A function. Thank you again, and let me introduce at this time Ms. Crystal Moore, third-year PhD student in Africana Studies Department.
Thank you, Gabriella, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Crystal Moore, and my pronouns are she, her. I have the distinct honor of introducing our speakers today. They are a panel of amazing Black women representing different places and lived experiences as historians. Brief introductions for our panelists today are as follows. Dr. Ashley Farmer is a historian of Black women's history, intellectual history, and radical politics. She is currently an associate professor in the Department of History, African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of Remaking Black Power, How Black Women Transformed an Era, published in 2017, and co-editor of New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition, published in 2018. Farmer's scholarship has appeared in numerous venues, including the Black Scholar and the Journal of African American History. Her research has also been featured in several popular outlets, including Vibe, NPR, the Chronicle Review, and the Washington Post. Her current book project is Queen Mother Audley Moore, Mother of Black Nationalism, the first full-length biography of Moore, whose career spanned nearly 70 years. Dr. Vanessa Holden is an associate professor of history, African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. She is also the director of the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative. Dr. Holden is the author of Surviving Southampton, African American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community, published in 2021, in which she explores the contributions of African American women and children, free and enslaved, to the Southampton Rebellion, also called Nat Turner's Rebellion. Dr. Holden's work and writing has been published in Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies, Perspectives on History, Process, a blog of American history, and The Rumpus. She also blogs for Black Perspectives and the Junto, a group blog on early American history. Dr. Holden serves as a faculty advisor or consultant on a number of public history and digital humanities projects, including Freedom on the Move, a digital archive of runaway slave ads, Black Horsemen of the Kentucky Turf, an exhibit chronicling the intersecting histories of African Americans and the horse industry in Kentucky, and a grant project aimed at bringing a virtual driving tour and a museum to Southampton County, Virginia, that interpret the Southampton Rebellion. Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson is an assistant professor in the Department of History of Johns Hopkins University and a fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Dr. Johnson is a historian of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. She is the author of Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, published in 2020. Wicked Flesh was the winner of the 2021 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize of the American Studies Association, the 2021 Wellesley Logan Prize from the American Historical Association, the 2020 Kemper and Leila Williams Prize for Louisiana History, the 2020 Rebel Women Lit Caribbean Readers Award for Best Nonfiction Book, an honorable mention for the 2021 Pauli Murray Book Award from the African American Intellectual History Society, and a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize from the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Her work has appeared in Slavery and Abolition, The Black Scholar, Meridians, Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism, American Quarterly, Social Texts, the Journal of African American History, the William and Mary Quarterly, Debates in the Digital Humanities, and Forum Journal, to name a few. Dr. Johnson is an internationally recognized digital humanist. She is the director of LifeX Code, Digital Humanities Against Enclosure, and Senior Research Associate with the Center for the Digital Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. I would like to extend a special thank you to our panelists on behalf of the Graduate Colloquium Committee for graciously accepting our invitation to join us this afternoon. As you can hear from the introductions, we have brought together 3 outstanding scholars whose work, as you will see, stretches across 300 years of Black women's history and across the African diaspora. So without further ado, I will now turn the Zoom mic over to my colleague, Bonnie Maldonado, our panel moderator.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Crystal mentioned, my name is Bonnie Maldonado and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm a second-year student in Africana Studies. At this moment, we want to begin the conversation by giving our panelists 10 to 15 minutes to introduce their previous and current scholarly work. Then we will move to a moderated segment of conversation and ask specific questions that relate to our theme. After that, we will then open up the questions for our audience members. And for that portion, we ask you all to, while they're speaking, please generate your questions and use the Q&A function below so that we, the committee members, can start generating them together. Now we will be going in the order that the panelists were introduced. We will begin with Dr. Farmer, then Dr. Holden, then Dr. Johnson. Dr. Farmer, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you everybody for being here. I'm going to share just one slide on screen. Oops. All right. Okay, so today I want to focus my comments on the work I'm doing on Queen Mother Audley Moore, who you see here. And just in case anybody is unfamiliar with her, kind of the briefest of bios is she was born in 1898. She died in 1997. So we're talking almost a century of life. She is considered the mother of Black nationalism, and she was involved in every major moment from the Marcus Garvey movement of the 1920s to the Popular Front of the 1930s to civil rights and reparations organizing in the 1940s and 50s, through Black nationalists and Black Pan-Africanism of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's for these reasons that people often say, if Rosa Parks midwifed the civil rights movement, then Audley Moore is the mother of Black nationalism. And she has the honorific Queen Mother Moore, or Queen Mother Audley Moore, because she was known to everybody in the movement, both as a tireless organizer, but also a keen theoretician and figurehead within the movement. So given just that I told you kind of the briefest of biographies about her, it's a little astonishing that there is actually no complete work on her to date. Even though she knew some of the major movement leaders, and though she was the right hand of folks ranging from the 40s to the 80s, there has not been any major kind of scholarly tome of hers, and there has not been any kind of publication of her own writings. So we have to ask ourselves why that is. And the answer that I got when I started this was that she has no archive. And so that's why I bring up this picture, because I think this is particularly interesting. As you see her, this is in her Harlem apartment when she is in her 80s. And she was actually a very extensive self-archivist, right? She chronicled her life, she kept artifacts, and you can see these artifacts in this picture. And I just want to point out a few things just so you can kind of see the breadth and the depth of her research and her life. Certainly you see tons of books and papers, even though she had only a 4th grade education. She was very learned and read anything and everything related to political theory, organizing theory, etc. You see the woman on the back behind her, that is her sister, Eloise Moore, who she says is responsible for politicizing her, but also was kind of the chief theoretician of her life. And she's also been basically rewritten out of history. You see pictures of Malcolm X. She was a friend and mentor to Malcolm X. I've talked to many activists that talk about him actually coming to her home when she lived in Philadelphia, and them talking about everything from Pan-Africanism to reparations before he died. You see artifacts like the Shape of Africa, that wooden sculpture, and other sculptures along there. Those are gifts from her many trips to Africa in the 1970s. She went to Uganda, Nigeria, Tanzania, Guinea-Bissau. And in each of these places, she was feted as a queen of the movement and was met with various African heads of state. So then we have a question before us. If I actually can see the physical nature of her archive that she collected of herself, and I'm telling you about this extensive life that she lived, where did the archive go? And the stories that I have found about where the archive went are pretty amazing. Some say that it was put back to New Iberia, which is outside of New Orleans, about 2 hours, which is where she was born and raised. I've gone there and find no evidence of it. Some say it's in Ethiopia. She was, as a Garveyite, always finding Ethiopia as kind of a bastion of Black nationalism of the early and late 20th century. Some say the Ethiopian Coptic Church has it because she became an abbess of the Ethiopian Coptic Church. And I have actually sat in a talk where I talked about her, and a woman stood up and told me that she was wearing the very bangles that you see and the very headdress that you see, and that these were given to her by Queen Mother Moore. So the stories really are, I mean, we're on some like National Treasure stuff here, trying to find and track down where this stuff might be. But what is clear is that it is not housed in any archive. What is clear is that her family, who I've spoken with and visited with extensively, has none of it. And somehow it has all, you know, kind of evaporated or been skewed across perhaps the United States and maybe even the world, right? So the question then is, how do we write a history of somebody when we cannot find or we have this elusive archive? I think most people have seen it as a problem, but as I've been writing her biography, I've really seen it as an opportunity to reconceptualize what we understand as the archive and how we process and shape the archive. So what I want to posit to you today, as I'm thinking about how to talk about more in her archive, is not that it does not exist, but rather that it is what I call disorderly distributed. And what I mean by saying that it's disorderly distributed is that it is not placed in, a house with a finding aid. It's not ordered in the way one orders one's life. It's not corresponding to a particular place where she lived, right? But rather these artifacts that you see here and the many others that I've found in the process of writing the biography are strewn across all kinds of archival spaces, informal, formal. Maybe that woman was wearing the actual bangles and that's part of the archive too. We may never know, right? And that is what's made it very difficult, right, to write something cohesive about Moore. Now, what I have found is that it's not that, again, that there is no writing, there is no books, she doesn't have anything to say, but rather because that is disorderly distributed, it is not legible either to kind of archival practices or to the historical discipline. And more importantly, that illegibility has come to stand in for Moore herself. In other words, people have claimed that if the archive is discordant, so too must Moore's ideas be, so too must her actions be, and so too must her life be, right? And so I think that this is an opportunity here. We certainly see the limitations of such an archive, right, in putting things together. But I want to talk about what the possibilities of a disorderly distributed archive is, particularly when we're talking about researching women like Moore, Black women intellectuals more broadly, but certainly ones that were particularly hounded by the state. So I see a couple of possibilities, and maybe this discussion today, we can talk about more. The first is, if it is disorderly distributed, there is no narrative of what the archive is, what her life was, what it should be. And by narrative, I mean what an archivist has put together in a finding aid, collected in the front of the finding aid, and then laid out over folders and boxes for you. And then we know how our minds immediately kind of follow that logic of the finding aid, right? So in an attempt not to put everything together, it forces us to pull out new histories, right? To think of different ways of ordering Black women's lives like Moore's. And it doesn't bind us to the same kinds of disciplinary structures that a more orderly archive might do. The second thing I want to offer is that it really challenges the idea of the archive and the architecture itself. I have written elsewhere about the perils of what I called archiving while Black, or the idea that you have to go into the archive that can sometimes take on the carceral logics that we know well of the prison, and how difficult it is to be a Black body and a Black woman's body in that space. So having a disorderly distributed archive allows for some folks like me, for example, to archive without the watchful eye of kind of the panopticon, or the kind of surveillance state of the archive. It allows me to go and spend time with her son. It allows me to go, into archives in the public library, allows me to go into, different community centers, et cetera. But there's nobody kind of gatekeeping me from those things. And it offers an opportunity to kind of move more freely as a person of color as we navigate these archival spaces, right? Versus having to go into one kind of central temple, as it were, as an archive, the way many things are collected. And then the third thing is perhaps it offers somebody like Moore a little bit of protection that she was not afforded in her life. For those who are not late 20th century scholars, many women like Moore were hounded by the FBI through a program called COINTELPRO, or the counterintelligence program. Moore, for example's archive on that front is voluminous and lasted for more than 60 years. It is in fact perhaps one of the most intact biographies of her life. And perhaps we can talk about what it's like to kind of have to pull archival material from an FBI file as well. But by not having everything neatly ordered, by having things be discordant, it offers perhaps some protection of things that she did not want seen or want known for a life of somebody who was being tracked and monitored day in and day out for the better part of 50 years. So certainly, like I said, while this disorderly distributed archive presents challenges, I do think that it offers us new ways of thinking about things. So I think I want to end just with a couple of quick questions that might provoke some conversation about what this does. So I'd like us to think perhaps how this unruly archive, or this orderly archive, challenges us to defy the rules of the discipline, right? And the rules of archiving and scholarly writing. I'd like us to think about the ways in which she refuses kind of the narration of the archive or the finding aid as a way of thinking about how we might create new narratives about Black women's lives. And also I'd like us to think about the fact that she kind of lives outside the traditional structure of the archive as a way for us to think about making new blueprints for how we might construct an archive or define an archive. But one of the things I think is really great about Moore's work is that at every moment throughout the 20th century, she was constantly challenging power dynamics and constantly challenging use of language. For example, she hated that people use the word Negro, and she always wanted to quote unquote de-Negroize people. So they would adopt kind of their African ancestors and names. So I think maybe one of the things that she invites us to do by not fitting neatly into the archive is take up these imperatives in our own work, right? What does it look like to challenge power, both in the ways in which we archive, but how we tell the stories? And what kind of new language might we develop from a discordant archive that could be useful for us going forward? So I think I'll stop with those two provocations and let some of my other panelists speak. But I look forward to hearing if you think that this kind of framework might be useful for archiving in your own lives.
Thank you, Dr. Farmer. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Holden.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really grateful for this chance to meditate again on rebellious archives, and not just archives of rebellions. In my time researching the Southampton Rebellion, I spent a lot of time thinking about the unwritten. We all have to if we study Black women's histories to some extent. But sometimes for me, as I've moved through the physical spaces of Southampton County in the present, it's not so much about what's unwritten. It's learning to read what's written in new ways and learning to accept new ways of writing. For me, an outsider in Southside Virginia, the most stunning testament to the rebellion, as locals still call it, is written in green street signs. All over the county, a legacy of 20th century 911 service. Numbered roads were converted to roads with street signs. And on those street signs are a number of key sites in the Southampton Rebellion, sites where murder took place in 1831. Cabin Pond Road, Porterhouse Road, and most famously, Blackhead Signpost Road. Blackhead Signpost is a crossroads in Southampton County, at which at least one enslaved individual's head was placed on a signpost and left to decay. Upon its return to dust, it was ever after painted black as a warning, as a testimony, and as a symbol of white power. That very symbol was kept and embedded on the county's Google map with the naming of this road. I have to think a lot about survival in my work, and survival along a couple of planes, both in the way that we use the term survivor to mean someone who's endured a tragedy or a malady, and in the way that we use survivor to mean the bereaved. I spent a lot of time thinking about remains. Nat Turner's remains famously were scattered, his skeleton and skull placed on display, his flesh, many enslaved people believed converted into a type of elixir for whites to ingest and gain power from in the county. It's somewhere in this this sort of milieu of remains that physical spaces in the county also serve as these sites of remembrance, but also sites of what remains, sites of what has survived. A critical testimony for me is one that comes from someone who was formerly enslaved in Southampton County years after the rebellion. Alan Crawford was raised by people who survived it, and his grandmother famously had an encounter with Nat Turner upon his capture. According to their family story, quote, "Grandma ran out, struck Nat in the mouth, knocking the blood out, and asked him, 'Why did you take my son away?'" It's there, somewhere between his grandmother's hand and Nat Turner's face, that a lot of my own work takes place, trying to understand really the force of her grief and the ways that that became their family story about this rebellion, that became the memory, a hand striking flesh, drawing blood. So survivor is a word we use for those who endure. It's a word that we use for the bereaved. And the Black communities of Southampton County were full of people who lived out both of those meanings. The thing about being a survivor and surviving is that there's no end date to that status. There's no point at which you are not surviving anymore. And that's true in the ways that this rebellion is embedded in the contemporary county's physical geography. So very quickly, at the center of my work is looking for and looking at the ways that both Black women and children were integral to the labor of survival. I don't treat survivor as a passive state. It's a series of practices, and it is work, and it is labor. I'm so going to give a couple quick examples of how I have to interface with various archives, including the contemporary one, before I turn it over to my co-panelists. So very quickly, where is Southampton County? This is a map of antebellum Virginia, and Southampton County is in what is called Southside Virginia, right here on the border with North Carolina. It's called Southside Virginia because it's on the south bank of the James River. Were we to zoom in on the county, so here's our county. Key geographic features include the Nottoway River, named for the county's original indigenous inhabitants. Descendant communities of the Nottoway go both by the name Nottoway and Chernahaka-Nottoway. They are the keepers of their own histories, but their history intersects with the histories that I study, because as you can see marked out on the map that I had made for my book, Indian land, really the only enclave of people who could be called free people of color, which included indigenous people at the time, that is where that enclave was. Today we will visit Jerusalem or Cortland, Virginia very quickly to talk about a geography that often is not highlit in the history of this rebellion, to talk about really the ways that the geography itself is a rebellious archive. And I have to mention Cypress Bridge quickly because that's the point at which they were trying to cross, but were thwarted. We'll visit another watery site. We zoomed in on the half of the county where the rebellion took place. Here is our rebellion route. I was sure to include swamps in my map making because I wanted not only for folks to be able to see the roads they're avoiding, but also the swamps they're using to help them move around the county. These swamps are still there. And I'll take you quickly to a watery site that is its own site of commemoration. Cabin Pond is the site at which Nat Turner famously met with a handful of enslaved men on the evening of August 21st, 1831, from which in the early hours of August 22nd, they launched a rebellion that moved from farm to plantation to farm with the goal of murdering every white man, woman, and child they encountered. No one, they were determined, would grow up to inherit them. Cabin Pond still exists. There's actually a road in Southampton County named for it. This is Cabin Pond. I was just there a couple of weeks ago filming in Virginia. It's fed from beneath by a natural spring. It periodically floods and drains. The thing about Cabin Pond is that it is very close to the place where Nat Turner hid out after the rebellion. He was missing for about 2 months after the rebellion occurred. And my project actually began with a question about this site. He hid in dugout caves in the area very close to the place where he was once enslaved. And as an undergraduate, I asked myself, who fed Nat Turner? Because he wasn't farming his own food. He couldn't hunt for it. He stole some of it, but couldn't really. Who was feeding him? that question came back to me when, while standing next to Cabin Pond with one of Nat Turner's descendants, he directed my attention to a piece of land that his cousin now owns. That land is the land that Nat Turner was once enslaved on. It was purchased by some of his descendants in the early 20th century. And recently, one of his descendants erected his own monument to his ancestor. And when I say steps, I really do mean just steps away from Cabin Pond. There is this sign on the property that reads, Nathaniel Nat Turner, illiterate minister, slave, and leader of the Southampton slave insurrection of August 21st, 1831, hid in caves near the site until his capture on October 30th, 1831. The sign itself was shot through so many times it was illegible. The county felt bad about that, so they replaced it. So you can tell from this image from 2019 that they just placed another sign directly on top of it. You can actually see the first pot shot had been taken by then. So it will be a continual site of renewing that particular commemoration. But something I want to draw your attention to is the language that his descendants use to commemorate their ancestor. So first they call it the Southampton slave insurrection, right? So what's important is not actually their ancestor, the leader, right? But Southampton and enslaved people in naming the event. But it's actually the spot that's being marked is him hiding. The event that's being marked is not the rebellion, it's that he evaded capture. And the family has actually curated a number of dugout caves for generations in the area that they believe their ancestor hid out in. And they're pretty tight-lipped about where those caves are. So it's been a continual sort of vernacular curation of their family's history and preservation of a particular kind of archive, right? That's purposely meant to stay hidden. In fact, it's an archive of a hidden archive. Like that's the whole point. One thing that I've learned to do over the years working with the archive of the Southampton Rebellion is to trust silence in ways that I think we all have to if we're going to study Black women. I have to look at documents that many, many, many other people have looked at. The court transcripts that are generated post-rebellion are very famous. They're in a collection of sources you can check out from the library. So there are many ways in which this rebellion appears to not be hidden at all, to just be in plain sight. But the thing about this, about the rebellion, is that what is in plain sight is a very carefully curated narrative of this rebellion. And other historians have talked about the ways that white lawmakers were very intent on making this rebellion look as small as possible, to not lean into the expansiveness of community participation, including the roles of people who were not enslaved Black men. So one place where I deal with sort of layered alternate geographies in my work is Jerusalem, now Cortland, Virginia. And actually talk about the downtown geography of Cortland, Jerusalem at the time. I talk about the proximity of the jail, and here's an image of it from 1900 to give you an idea. I think sometimes when we say jail, we imagine contemporary prisons, but it's important to note this is a 2-cell wood-clad building. So they really stuffed about 50 enslaved people into a 2-room building, creating a site of information exchange. So a gathering of 50 enslaved people in downtown Jerusalem would have been a reason to call up the militia in any other circumstance, but here they're actually facilitating a place for them to swap information about their trials, for them to get information from people who are milling about this courtyard. The clerk's office, where all of this was recorded and written down. This is an image of it from 1900. And the courthouse, this is an image of a building that was built over the exact site of the courthouse a couple years after. So it's like 1832, 1834-ish, but it's built with the exact same layout. It's just brick instead of wood. That brick courthouse is still the courthouse in Southampton County. So they added those pillars in the 1920s, but it's the same spot. And even in the current renovation of that building, that original courthouse is being preserved. I had to learn to use place as its own archive and physically walk around downtown Cortland and note that the one-time site of the hanging tree. So I'm standing in the general area of the hanging tree, and even in the contemporary period, you can see the top of the courthouse. So understanding what it would have meant to be walked from the jail to the courtroom for trial in full view of the hanging tree, and often through a crowd of white people who were insistent that they see the justice they wanted to see. So thinking about these geographies as a thing to move through instead of hover over. But again, to get back to remains, turning about 180 degrees, even presently right across the street, is the site of the Potter's Field. It's still land owned by the county on which they will not build structures, but it is also the site of mass graves where generations of people convicted of felonies, impoverished people, and yes, the 18 people executed for participation in the rebellion, their remains are there too. Of course, I also look at the micro geographies of the archive, and I have to look at the geography of the physical documents I'm looking at. I've been to Southampton County's courthouse where all of these original documents are housed. I've looked at the microfilm of these documents, I've read the transcriptions of these documents, and I've spent time with the physical minute books that are these table-sized books where a clerk by hand wrote out what happened on each court date, sometimes from memory. To open up a big page of one of these books is to open up a different kind of map, and it's sort of a map of time. So for example, here is where one court date begins. You actually have to turn the very large minute book page. We're really talking about books that are about two feet high. They're very large. And it isn't until about 2.5 pages later that the first trial concerning someone who might have been involved in a rebellion exists. So if you disaggregate these trials, right, then you miss all this other stuff, all these other people, all these other actions that are happening at court that day. For example, this group of people who directly are juxtaposed to this trial, a group of free people of color who've come to court on the very same day, walked through that very same geography, sat and waited their turn to have their freedom added to the record officially. Often in groups, right? Black freedom is being attested to in the exact same space, both in the record as a map of time, but also in the courtroom itself. In 2015, a local Marine Corps veteran stood up in a town council meeting, and while he noted that there was a lot going on about Confederate monuments, of which there is a giant one next to the courthouse currently, he said what most mattered to him to see gone was Blackhead Signpost Road. He notes that he has to drive with his children and grandchildren down that road. And he didn't know who could get rid of that name, but he wanted it gone. In February of 2021, thanks to local Black activism, including Michelle Covington, who's pictured on the picture below, the Blackhead Signpost Road's name was officially changed to Signpost Road. So here's where Blackhead Signpost is in the geography of the rebellion. Here's the road that was named for it. And thanks to local academics and a coalition of basically academics, activists, and the descendant community, a commemorative Virginia historical plaque is also posted next to the new street signs for Signpost Road, right, that really acknowledges this violence against Black bodies as history, right? So instead of a contemporary pathway to drive down, to have it remembered in the way that descendant communities want it remembered. I touched down on these sites of geography and space as sites of archival significance, because I think often when we talk about histories, particularly ones people think they know about because they've heard a famous name, there are sides of it that folks want to label as sort of unknown or unheard of or lost or hidden. When in reality, the descendant communities in Southampton County absolutely know and have actually actively preserved these histories. That's why, Dr. Farmer, I love this sort of disordered archive. In the silences that they've kept, right, is their resistance against having their archives colonized, their archives repurposed, their archives disappeared. And I think that there's a lesson to be learned here from vernacular practices that can help us understand better, right, how to interact with place and space and with the ways that sometimes archives are the land itself. And with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Holden. Dr. Johnson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. And thank you to everyone here, to the organizers, to Dr. Farmer and Dr. Holden. It is always, every single time, a deep, deep pleasure to hear you speak about your work and about this work that we share in thinking through Black history, Black women, all of this. So thank you guys for sharing here. Can anybody see the screen? Is it going through okay? All right, so I'm going to start with an acknowledgement, a New Orleans land acknowledgement. I am not in New Orleans. I'm in the land of the Piscataway, Susquehannock, and Eastern Band of Cherokee peoples, also known as Baltimore. But that is where the work, so much of the work that I'm interested in and investigating, where Wicked Flesh comes out of, but also other work that we're doing now through a Life Code project, Life Code Against Enclosure project called Keywords for Black Louisiana, is rooted, and that is New Orleans. So, and I'm always in search of land acknowledgements that acknowledge this very complex history that hopefully I'll be able to touch on in just a little bit. Let me set the timer before I talk too fast and too much. So I just want to acknowledge the land upon which the colonial city of New Orleans sits has been and is known as Balbancha. Balbancha is a Choctaw word for a place of other languages and was commonly used by many nations such as the Okolopisa, Bayagula, Chitimaca, Choctaw, Biloxi, Huma, and Tunica. The surrounding area along the Mississippi River has traditionally included the Natchez, the Tanisas, the Chawasha, Washa, as well as others. Tribes continue to come and trade on this land and also settle on the banks of Lake Pontchartrain, which is Choctaw land, and along waterways in the Fortune Terrebonne Parish, which is Chitimaca area. There are several tribes who live in this region currently, including but not limited to the Ile de Jean Charles Band of the Chitimaca, Choctaw, Biloxi Tribe, United Huma Nation, and Pointe-au-Chien Indian Tribe. And I think it's really important to kind of speak those names for a lot of ways of thinking about indigeneity and land and the kind of shoals between Black studies and Indigenous studies, but also because one of the things that is powerful about looking at Gulf Coast history as not exceptional, which folks do like, New Orleans is so exceptional. It's not exceptional. It does allow us to refract how these Black and Indigenous histories do unite and come together and how those are related to empire. And I'm sure you hear the French and French-ish place names here. So, you know, one of the things that I want to kind of talk through today are some different ways of thinking about how I look at various sources and how important it is, I would argue, to really think creatively, as my co-panelists have mentioned, about where and how we investigate the histories of those who have not necessarily spoken back to the archive directly. I think we're in a really powerful moment, as Dr. Farmer related, of thinking about the archive in its physical form, in its architecture, as Dr. Holden related, of thinking about the archival documents themselves as having a geography that tells us something about the place in the moment. And I think we have to keep saying that over and over, because I think it is the the case and tradition of empire to assert itself in how we understand what the narrative of the past is and who has authority over that, who has authority to speak into it, and what kinds of documents are allowed to tell that story, which archives, brick and mortar, and also conceptual are allowed to be named as legitimate in that telling. And so I want to say it again, as always, that I think there's something really, really critical here in thinking about how we use everything around us in order to tell the stories of those who existed in the past and in African diasporic sense are, depending on what your tradition is, remain with us even today in the present. For my work, I investigate documents, sources, texts. I'll use the word text because I think that's more resilient. Texts from Saint Louis du Senegal, from Gorée and present-day Dakar, from the Caribbean, particularly Saint-Domingue, but also Martinique, Guadeloupe as well, from the land formerly known and presently known as Mobancha, and now Gulf Coast, Louisiana, New Orleans. And those, the journey for those documents didn't always even take me to these sites. For example, the colonial documents for all of these places actually remain in France in the Outre-mer archives in Aix-en-Provence. And that is a fact of those of us who are doing this early modern period, that the documents that empires created around their colonial subjects remain with those empires and disproportionately remain in places like Spain, France, Portugal, Netherlands, and otherwise. And so that in and of itself was a really interesting kind of experience in thinking about the geography of where documents might be. Before we get too far, I do want to kind of think a little bit with, how does Black theory frame how we enter into documents and documentation? And so for me, one of the key things was really thinking critically about how we understood where African women and women of African descent showed up in the archive, whether that be images like this one, which we'll come back to in a little bit, or whether that be in text. One of the guiding lights in the work for me and in thinking about histories of slavery in particular broadly, and particularly how gender and sexuality intersect in those histories, is thinking about flesh. And of course, this draws very much from Horton Spillers, although more recently from so many others who are thinking about flesh and bringing, elaborating on her work and elaborating on each other's work and the rich conversations happening right now. And this question of the flesh, of ungendering, of commodification, and of thinking about gender in truly expansive ways, not as lip service, as adding masculine and feminine and then shaking and stirring, but as thinking about there are more than two genders. Like just sitting with that and understanding that before we encounter and go into an encounter with the archive. What does it mean to sit with that and to think with that? What does it mean to think about gender as a thing that is getting created in this moment? That in fact we can understand the ways that Black womanhood, Black feminists is getting literally created, white womanhood is getting literally created in this moment. And how do we begin to kind of track that and try and see that even in the silences and the gaps of colonial documents and this colonial and colonialized archive? There we go. This is just kind of lay out some of the geography, just kind of, get a sense, because we don't always, look at a map and get a sense of the broadness of our world. But this was in thinking about also how to kind of guide the work. For me, is always about where is relation happening, right? Where is relation in diaspora and archipelagos? Where are those happening? Where are those building out from? And in this case, the New Orleans Atlantic world that I resonated with and operated in was guided by, in some ways, that empire. Still those imperial documents in those archives, but also the other kinds of relationality that are happening. But that doesn't mean that, for me, I think there's also something interesting in thinking about not letting those archives, those imperial European physically based archives, also dictate where and how the historical subjects themselves operated. And in this, again, thinking with Dr. Farmer's very poignant critique of, because the archives of Queen More are considered disorderly, she gets considered disorderly. And in some ways we do that same thing with the period of slavery, because enslaved people's, materials are in different places because they are not necessarily always authoring their documents themselves. They are seen as not being authors. And I think that's a fundamental misreading of how enslaved lives were lived and how they actually can, we can think of them appearing in the archive. One example of this that emerged very immediately, and I want to say that this emerged, that any encounter for me, at least, and I think broadly in archives, is always communal. And so this document and my encounter with Marie Baud's encounter with me really happened in conversation with other colleagues, thinking of Lindsay Gish and Guillaume Aubert, who were also thinking about what does it mean to be an African woman in the moment of the 18th century, in the moment of the slave trade. And that kind of communal sharing of documents and resources, I think, is a thing we don't talk enough about, but it's a thing that definitely we want to talk a little bit about, perhaps in the Q&A. But Marie Baud, Femme du Jampinet, is 23 years old and emerges from the archive out of documents that are about her husband. They are living at Ile de Saint Louis, which is eventually emerges as the colonial capital, but in this moment is essentially a kind of sandbar off the coast of present-day Senegal, that one of two sites that the French have been allowed to build forts on. And it's really important to think about how we enter African history into our analyses, especially those of us during the earlier period, but I think broadly, this idea that Europeans are engaging and have some kind of dominion and balance of power that they don't have, I think is really pernicious in our work. In fact, Europeans are there with permission, and in fact are constantly terrified that they are going to misstep with the African polities that are in the region, which leads to how they decide to do things like litigate cases like the one that lands Marie Baud in front of the judges. Her husband has killed another resident of the Comtois. In fact, because he insulted him via insulting his wife, and the F is the F word that you think it is. And so what does it mean to encounter the documents in which you have been told, as I was, that you're not going to find African women in these documents? They're just not there. And in fact, they're there, and not only there, but they are key players in various events that are happening throughout the 18th century encounter between French sailors and company officials and African polities and the Atlantic African, Afro-European, however we might describe it, communities. I describe it as Afro-European, as does Hilary Jones and Mathieu du Senegal. Afro-European community that is emerging here, because it is this insult that then cause being a kind of loose word, Jean Pinet to kill Pierre Legrand, who is the soldier who speaks these words. And that leads to him coming before the judges as well as herself. And he's deported from Senegal and ends up, as this loads, and ends up across the Atlantic in Louisiana. There we go. And so, we come again to this, this image by Dominique Lamiral, which is not the earliest extant images of the Signas, but is one of the earlier ones, later 18th century one. And this is, in some ways, the ways that the image of free African women who are owning enslaved people, mostly women, who are owning property, who are engaging in trading relations, intimate relations, and creating economic as well as kinship partnerships with Europeans. This is how they are, this is how they're understood to be and how they're portrayed. But this is not necessarily the kind of ways that Marie Baud maybe would have operated in. So then there's a question always of thinking about what are the ways that we want to understand the kind of refraction of African femininity through French eyes. At the same time that we're understanding a context in which this probably more accurately captures the kind of lived reality of daily life in a world in which the slave trade itself is operating as a space for trade as well as celebration, in which you have here at Gorée, which is the larger map of Gorée, I'm just gonna skip this, you have this kind of fantasy of villages separated according to French cartographers. But when, so you see here, it says Village des Chrétiens, which is Christian laborers, Village des Bambaras, which is presumably non-Christian, possibly enslaved, possibly not laborers, villages of the habitants, which were presumably your Africans, very, very neat, just, cloistered together. We know that this is not the real life that people are living. And it's that struggle, right? Like it's that struggle between this kind of imperial desire to present a particular kind of order and the reality. And still there, we can kind of read into some kind of spaces of possibility and other ways of thinking about the archive and the way that African women show up in the archive. So this image, obviously very different from Lamiral's image, is by a son of Senegal, David Boilat, who goes to France to get educated, comes back, and he writes a book, Equis Senegalese, essentially a kind of early history of Senegal, and he does images like this. And so this is Ndete Yala, who was a royal official of Walo, one of the Wolof states. And what's interesting about this is that even though this is later than a period that I will be looking at, you see some of the legacies of the kinds of markers of femininity, of power, of autonomy, even in this earlier period. So you have, for instance, you have the smoking of tobacco. You have the paquettes, which might be holding tobacco, but might also be holding gris-gris. You have jewelry, which is a trade item that was very much circulated and seen as a marker of distinction within free African women's networks. Mouchoir de tête, which is the conical head wrap, still iconic within, whoops, see, that tells me that I am running out of time. I know that. Signal society. You have those sitting, calmly at the riverbank. And so you have nothing else to do, which is a reminder that there is somebody else laboring for you. And you have the campañas, which is another aspect of a trade item that is getting circulated in these periods. One of the things that I want to kind of leave us with is that there are certainly these kind of material aspects and other kinds of battles with femininity and really kind of the rebellious and wicked ways that African women still continue to show up despite what imperial officials wish to remark on them. But you also have ways of thinking about what does it mean to work through the data itself, right? And so one of the things that I think would be interesting to talk about, or what does it mean to work through Black data out of the slave trade? How do we understand it? How do we think about that in the context, again, guided by formulations like Flesh, to think about the percentage of boys, girls, women, and men who were part of the slave trade to Louisiana. So this is the 1719 to 1743 French slave trade to Louisiana. This is another one of those who were disembarked and pressed against that, just so that we can see the kind of comparison. You see those who were embarked there in that kind of brownish, red. Let me just skip these really quickly. And what are the ways that we can get called to where we have names, like Maribaud on one part, also think about what happens where we don't have names. So this is a profile of La Milice Sarifique, which is the French version essentially of the Brooks. There's an amazing book out now, La Milice Sarifique Navire Nucléaire by Bertrand Guyette. that has the images from the ship, paintings that were created around it that are also circulated in a kind of abolitionist framework. And the detail in them is devastating and powerful. And so you see images like this of a suckling child as well. The last thing I will leave you with is these are not images of the ship, but when we're thinking about, where we attune to, we can think, even further, thinking about Dr. Holden's work on the geography of document, the microgeography of the archive. This is the marginalia, essentially, of slave ship register, of sample slave ship register from that same trade. This is actually the ship that Maribaud embarks from Senegal to Louisiana on, following her husband when he's deported from Nantes over to Louisiana. It's a little bit of a longer story, but this is to say, there is her name, not on this page, where she is not named. She's just a free mulâtresse who is taken on board. But in the marginalia is actually where you see the death notices. So the document itself will have, tacking, east, west, different kind of navigation markers. The marginalia is where you see Black death. As well as Black life, because you do have some notes on revolt. And I think that's something there that is really important to think about in that transition from Maribaud being before officials, us having her mini biography, to thinking about what the margins do and what can happen in the margins and what then emerges on the other side of the Atlantic. What would happen if we understood these as different spaces where the flashpoints of African women, free African womanhood, enslaved personhood, as well as what becomes Black womanhood, Black masculinity, Black manhood on the other side of the Atlantic. How does that funnel through? How is that a process? And how does that leave its taint on the archive at different moments? So I'll stop there.
Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for your wonderful presentations. I know I'm not the only one in thanking you so far because the chat is fantastic, and thank you all for engaging it with it in that way. Dr. Farmer, Dr. Holden, and Dr. Johnson, we brought you all together today for a variety of reasons, but some of which I'm sure are, and as you've all named, are extremely apparent from what you named in your presentations. But for now, we're going to move into the Q&A section, and I will then offer a set of provocations that connect to our theme and contextualize with how we see your work, we the committee members, see your work intersecting to open up space for a true conversation. After those offerings, I'm gonna turn my camera off because you all have 20 minutes to just discuss amongst yourselves and dance with those questions as you please. And after those 20 minutes, I'll turn my camera back on to kind of signal to the audience that this is where we'll be bringing in their questions that they've provided. A huge thank you to the folks that have already offered questions. We see them and we will be already incorporating them. And as those questions are asked, including the ones that I'll make, they'll be placed into the chat function as a point of reference for accessibility purposes, but then also if audience members would like to use those questions as a point of reference as they create their own questions. So go into those provocations. The theme for the colloquium, Black Women and Rebellious Archival Acts, was inspired by all of your current work, which encouraged us to think about the diverse ways that, one, Black women throughout history across various temporalities and geographies have initiated, engaged in, and relied on rebellious acts in their struggles for freedom, and two, how Black women, historians, and scholars often adopt rebellious methodological approaches while engaging with archival collections or documents in search for Black women's experiences, intellectual work, and community organizing efforts. So the first question we have before we get into those two prongs is, do you even consider your work as a rebellious act? And then to get into the prong and the provocations and thinking about the first prongs, could you talk more about how your individual scholarship both defines and highlights the rebellious acts of Black women throughout history, and why centering this kind of history is critical for history as a discipline and for the field of Africana studies more broadly? And for the second prong, could you also talk a little bit more about the challenges or perhaps gifts of either generally or experientially that scholars face while trying to excavate Black women's histories and experiences from archives that, as Dr. Farmer mentioned, are disorderly distributed? And also, what do you think it means for a scholar to adopt rebellious methodological approaches to overcome some of those challenges, and what are some of the methods that you are all use to when you're confronted by some of these challenges? And now to the specificities of your work and things that you all mentioned in your lovely presentations. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for bringing up the point about what does it mean to read data, because in Wicked Flesh, you offer the concept of no value to highlight the ways in which empirical data fails us because Black life is not fully captured in archival data, and thereby limiting how we can bear witness to Black women, specifically women marked as wicked. So as an historian and digital humanist, how do various forms of technology offer a way to, quote, as you say, remember Black women across the Atlantic African diaspora and behold intimate and rebellious acts outside of the physical form and architecture that there is? And are there, if any, limits that resemble that of the traditional archive? And as a follow-up question, what does this mean perhaps for Black futures as we are all then building our own archives as well? Moving to Dr. Holden, in preparing for this Q&A, I was reminded that you and Dr. Johnson are co-organizers of the Queering Slavery Working Group, and I was excited because this brings the question of what do working groups then offer as an act of resistance in a field that is usually quite isolated, and perhaps moves to what Dr. Johnson was signaling in her talk, moves towards a sharing of archives. And furthermore, what words of advice do you have to offer to grad students that are thinking about innovative ways of research? Now moving towards the specificity of your work, your book, let me rewind. Your book, thank you, pays attention to the contribution of Black women and children to Nat Turner's Rebellion by mapping out their intimate relationships to space, place, and time. Your work is a critical intervention in the previous scholarship that assumes that Black people adhere to prescribed gender roles and in American rebellions and resistance. This scholarship creates a gender binary in which you state in your book, quote, enslaved men rebel while enslaved women resist. Firstly, when we read that as a committee, it gave us chills, so we wanted to acknowledge that. And secondly, we would like to ask if you could please elaborate on that quote. And as a follow-up question, we were thinking a lot about refusal and what that does then to both rebellion and resistance. So how does then refusal unsettle rebellion, resistance, and as you mentioned in your talk, survival? And furthermore, prescribed gender roles, and thinking here too of Dr. Johnson and Dr. Farmer, sexuality and womanhood. And finally, Dr. Farmer, in the spirit of collaboration, I was reminded with your work of the edited piece by Dr. Savage, who was here, Dr. Bay, Dr. Griffin, and Dr. Jones, in Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, making several interventions of both having a collectively published piece, but highlighting the intellectual tradition and contributions of Black women. And you cite this and them as well in your own book, Remaking Black Power. So in your previous interviews and in your presentation, your questions of where did the archive go and archives that are disorderly distributed signal to actively having to train and retrain yourself to be attuned to Black women's contributions and to what it looked like during the Black liberation movement. So can you speak more, and this signals also to one of the questions we saw in the Q&A, can you speak more to what this retraining not only looked like as you disentangled resistance and rebellion, but also what this retraining felt like for you, particularly as you signaled, having to pull, and you mentioned this, that perhaps we can go into this more, having to pull from archives from the FBI. And also, I believe you've done it as well, in interviewing women that provided feedback on how you were conducting your research in Remaking Black Power. Have there been any instances when interviewees have added or negated something that you learned about in historical archives? And perhaps what are the benefits of interviewing living archives? So I know that is a huge set of questions that I just gave y'all to just play with, but we also have them in the chat. And I will pass it over to the panelists to answer these provocations and discuss them in whatever they please. It can be a question that I asked one of your colleagues. It doesn't matter, but I'll be back in 20 minutes and I'm excited to listen.
Like we're getting free play.
We have free time.
I'll just start when you your question about do I see my work as an act of rebellion? My first thought was no, because that's just what we do, right? But after thinking about it a little more, I realized that perhaps I've become so conditioned to kind of both to the lovely world that Black women historians have created for me, where I don't have to legitimize what I'm doing, and also just paying no mind to those that feel like I do, that I have kind of put out of my mind that there have been some very real resistance to the kind of work that I do. And when we're talking about resistance of a different kind, right? And so just to give two kind of short stories, when I first started the dissertation that was Remaking Black Power, I'm sure most folks that engage in this work was told it couldn't be done. And the reason it couldn't be done was because there was no archive of Black women, certainly not Black women intellectuals, talking and writing about Black power. And I'm like, this was like not that long ago, right? Like, for Dr. Johnson to Dr. Holden, maybe not, but I'm like, they're still down the street and alive. So surely this can't be that hard, right? But what they meant was that there wasn't the right kind of source to legitimize the kinds of work that I wanted to do. And then there's been a second kind of resistance that I have gone to places where I've talked about remaking Black power, and I've always been asked, am I too close to the sources or am I too overtly political? And which is wild to me because I didn't know we were still teaching people that writing history was not a political act. But I guess somewhere we're still telling people that that is what it is. And so then I remind those kinds of moments, despite kind of the care that Black women historians have shown me about my work, remind me that even if I don't see it as a rebellious act, it is still in rebellion with what people think we should be doing in the academy, what people think that we should be writing about, and how people think we should be writing about it. And I think that's important to keep in mind, especially for perhaps some of the younger scholars here, that you will meet resistance of a different sort when trying to get to these stories. And it's just a reminder to kind of pay it no mind and trust your gut that you're right, and that you can come up with a way to get at the questions that you're asking in the archive that you have.
Yeah. I can definitely jump in there because I think I feel the same, that I am surprised. I still get this question when I talk about the book in different places. They're like, oh, what made you so brave to write this story? And I'm like, was it brave to write about Black women? Like, was that was the brave thing? Or like, what made you think this would be, or brave to make this the first book, right? I have, I've had to step back and say, yes, this is the ability to write this book and not experience the kind of backlash that Deborah Gray White experienced trying to write Aren't I a Woman? She writes about in the Telling Histories volume, that other scholars have experienced just trying to ask different questions about the sources and ask questions that might open up space to then allow Wicked Flesh to walk through, the Southampton revolt to walk, Surviving Southampton to walk through. That is work that's a path that was laid, I feel like, before I came. So just to not just name Dr. White, but also name folks like Leslie Harris, like Jennifer Morgan, Stephanie Camp, Erica Dunbar, Gabrielle Foreman, who I regard as incredibly historical, although she will not necessarily say that she's a historian. She comes out of English, and so many more that I'm not necessarily going to remember right now off the top of my head because I'm on the spot. But to at least name a few, because I think it's really, really important that we understand that this journey to be able to speak of a history in which Black women, however we define that Blackness and that womanhood, as expansively or narrowly, that is a particular privileged position that as recent as 1985 didn't exist, right? So Deborah Gray writes Aren't I a Woman? And then the Library of Congress subject heading for female slave is created the next year. It's that recent. I was a child, I was eating Cheerios, And so how do we, how do I sit with that and appreciate that and give homage to that? And the work is still, I think, unfortunately, it is still rebellious, because the way of thinking about the archive and the way of thinking about history is still not freed from those kinds of imperial predations that say this is the kind of source that is legitimate, this is the voice that is legitimate. No, don't write the narrative in this way. Don't bring yourself into it. Don't bring the politics into it. And so, yeah, I guess, yeah, for that same question, in a similar vein, it has to be regarded as rebellious. And at the same time, I also want even more rebellious acts, right? You know, like I'm thinking about the ways, I'm constantly, and this maybe goes to the QSWG question, thinking about the ways to write queerer history, more gender expansive history. Oh, Dr. Broccoli Brown, thank you, Tiana. Speak that name, speak the name, that's right. Hillary Jones, absolutely. Aileen Bowles, Psyche Williams Forson, all Black women on my committee. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, bringing, you know, like how to get even more rebellious, even more transgressive in how we tell the stories of those who lived in the past, and even how we think about what the past is, which is some of the work that is happening that I'm trying to work on for a second book project. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think, you know, I take that question up in a couple ways. So on the one hand, writing about American slave rebellion is a boys' club, like it is. It's a boys' club. Their American rebellions are named for great men, and the ones that aren't are, you know, overlooked, glossed over, not thought of. And Nat Turner is an American archetype, like completely divorced from the actual historical person. There's a Nat Turner who's a race man. There's a Nat Turner who is, you know, a civil rights advocate. There is a Nat Turner who is a Black Power icon. There is a Nat Turner who is a Black Lives Matter, right? Like, so because of that, the transgressive moment of saying, not only am I, from my subject position, going to write this, but also I'm gonna poke at this, you know, great man history boys club around American slave rebellion was just like a constant set of questions about how. Right. That was the kind of question that I ran up against, was not so much don't or you shouldn't, but more of a like, well, how are you even?
Yeah.
Right. Like, it's not like there's some new document you found. You know, how are you even doing that? Well, you can't really prove it. Right. I've had people show up to seminar like, I just came by because I didn't think it was possible. So, you know, good luck. And I will be interested to see, as now it's out in the world, right, in which ways do I get pushback? Because some of the assumptions that have been made about my work is that I'm trying to decenter Nat Turner or devalue his role as a liberatory thinker, which is not something that's in the book. But so in that way, undercutting that, I mean, it was like Stephanie Camp, rest her soul, who she was out there, and that was it, as far as thinking about women. And the way that I found, you know, in the field, folks were dealing with it, dealing with her work, was to then sort of what they did for the classic civil rights movement, which is to kind of build this like, well, it's that women are over here doing this and men are over here doing that, and there's this like perfect binary and separate spheres sort of slave rebellion. And I was like, you know, I'm trying to think of a way for this to even work out in the present, let alone in an isolated farming community in the 1830s. Like, this doesn't make, you're not making any sense. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that women aren't involved. It doesn't make sense. So I think in that way, sure. And we'll see how folks receive it. But I think that there is a lot more work to be done, and that can also be something that folks find like, oh, so you're going to say this isn't a settled question for us, that it's these one or two inspired great men who led these, and that's it. On the other hand, I come from storytellers. My mother's side of the family, I mean, to be fair, a lot of them don't let the truth get in the way of a good story, but they're very good at telling stories. And the way that I first learned Black women's history, and the way that I first learned the history of the Latinas that I come from, right, were through stories and were through the community of women who raised me. And that tradition and that way of saying, oh, that's what they're teaching you in school. Let me tell you about your grandmother, or let me tell you about our family, or let's talk about North Carolina, where your grandfather's from, right? There is a way that I learned to teach myself the kinds of histories that I write, not in academia. Like, I learned it through community and through the things that my elders wanted to pass on, which is its own kind of archive, because there are a number of things they dissembled about, that they did not want to talk to me about, that they were not going to be forthcoming about. And in my time in Southampton County, particularly with Turner descendants, they have these similar stories about what was revealed to them about their ancestry and what they then had to go search for, and what almost always women in their family were willing to disclose to them, right? So if there's a transgression, it's not that I'm a storyteller in a particular way now as a historian, right? It's what am I willing to go dig for, and what am I not willing to dissemble about? So that's a whole different thing when it comes to, well, what is our culture around what is and isn't spoken. And then I will say this, if I'm writing rebellious histories, I'm not doing it alone. I'm not going alone. My work centers on community, but the community has saved me as I do this work. The affect of this work is difficult to describe and quantify. And so without collaboration, which was something we're actually disincentivized in the field to do, right? I would not have made it. I think, I don't know, co-conspirator. I feel like it was a little rebellious for us to be plotting and scheming about queering slavery.
From a kitchen table.
Yeah, I know. I'll wait till that, till that emeritus status comes in to really spill the tea about. And I see Darius is on the party line today, so
Right.
plenty of co-conspirators in the house today.
I mean, I feel like that speaks so much to, doing this work in community is incredibly important. Having folks that you work in solidarity with, so there's being part of a tradition, right? And acknowledging and knowing that other people have laid stakes for you and have shed blood for you to be able to even speak these words and write out the stories that we are telling, and to go to the archives that we're able to visit. And then there's the kind of networks and the net of care that is created, or that we create laterally amongst ourselves. And so there's Queering Slavery Working Group for sure, and the Remix, shout out to Darius and Carter in the chat. But there's also, African American Intellectual History Society, which is one of the first places I encountered Dr. Farmer. These don't happen by magic. They seem very like, of course, that is a thing that we need, a queering slavery, consortium of folks who are trying to think about queer thought and Black queerness in the context of an earlier period. This seems like an of course thing that would happen, but it is actual work, and it's a labor of love and a labor of it's a kind of people work that I think we don't necessarily see as work and acknowledge as work, acknowledge as community and kinship. Is certainly not incentivized by the academy, but is absolutely necessary to work we do. And then it's seen as sort of what gets frustrating to me, if I can just spill a little bit real quick, is that then it becomes seen as sort of like naturalized to the academy. Like, oh, of course, isn't it AHIS? Like, we need a Black Intellectual History Society. Why wouldn't we have that? When actually that was like a battle to create. That was a battle for folks to create. And shout out to Ashley and Chris Bronner and everybody who was on the kind of early groundbreaking work of that organization. I think that there's something that's really important important there. And I think there's something to that as feminized labor and racialized labor, as labor that has emerged so much out of the hands, not entirely, but so much out of the hands of those who are, you know, non-Black Black masculine figures in the academy, non-cis straight Black men, that is worth noting that. You know, it's worth noting where that kind of, whose hands have been on these organizations and working groups and communities, and whose hands are doing that material enfleshed labor to keep things going together and keep people cared for and sustained, you know. And Queen Mother Moore's work also, you know, in a lot of ways so much aligns with that as well, and how she shows up.
Yeah. I was thinking about two things that you said. First is kind of dichotomy of the public-private. So in my work, it kind of shows up as, you know, the women organized and the men theorized, right? And there's no kind of idea that you could possibly have thoughts or theories that are developing, that are disseminated, that are so well disseminated, for example, with Queen Mother Moore and reparations, that often we don't even trace it back to her in that same kind of way. And so I think that, you know, to the question about what does it look like to kind of untrain one's eye? That was probably the biggest thing, is that when, you know, I was told I couldn't write the first book, it was that this doesn't look like intellectualism in the ways in which we think intellectualism should come from, right? And so that means that it can't be culture, it can't be art, it can't be a song, it can't be a poem. I mean, truthfully, the thing we have the most of like Queen Mother Moore's archive are really bad poems, like really bad poems. I'm just like, oh girl. But there's a way in which she's creating these sometimes on the spot in the middle of a protest and scribbling on them to get up and talk, right? To galvanize people. It's you are watching thinking in action, right? You are watching that movement go kind of, you know, thinking and theorizing on the run, as it were, and taking in the world around her. And so, you know, it's really interesting that that still gets read as more of an organizing act than a theorizing act. And I think partly because it's cultural in the poetry, partly because of where the kind of the act takes place. It's not, you know, in some kind of lofty library or in a newspaper or, you know, at a speech at a podium in the same kind of way. So I just think that's really interesting. And one of the things that, to the question of kind of having to unlearn, right, you know, even being trained in kind of a Black studies department, there's still we're still beholden to boundaries, I think, in disciplines and ways of knowing in some ways that we shouldn't be. And so I think that we sometimes have too much of a fidelity to particularly the historical boundaries because we need to be legible in order to get a job, which is a real thing. I don't want to discount that. But I think that had trained me not to see some of these things as theorizing in action, right? Not to see some of the artwork that I read or, you know, the text that I find as kind of theorizing in action. And I think that I took a lot of work of kind of going back to the same sources. And to Vanessa's point, sources that everybody had read, like everybody's seen the Black Panther newspaper, right? It's not an out there source. So it really demands that you ask a different question and keep reading and looking and viewing again to kind of unsee what everybody else sees that's already in your head, and kind of look for what kinds of things might spark an answer to the questions that you're asking.
Yeah.
Well, we're all talking about like these people who are like the women I look at are surveilled in ways, you know, like untangling the surveillance mechanisms is just like the first thing I have to get through. Is just, so what are they resisting? Who are they resisting? What systems that are built literally around them, that are run by people they grew up next to who now own them, you know, you know, not just kind of thinking about them so like waking up every morning and thinking like, how can I thwart slavery today? No, right? Like Dr. Johnson is saying, whoa, how are they moving through this geography? What does it mean to be that savvy and know these enslavers that well that on a dime you have to make a quick calculation and a decision about, will I go to that meeting tonight? Will I tell other people about that meeting tonight? Am I just going to hand over this cornmeal right now and not ask any questions about where it's going or not? And like you're saying, Dr. Farmer, right? Like including that in our definition of resist, subsistence. Like if we're talking about just handing over some cornmeal, right? You are making calculations about your own subsistence and survival and an unknown individual's subsistence and survival. And the whole transaction is supposed to be illegible by design because you're under constant surveillance. I mean, like, I don't have the FBI as an apparatus, right? But I have all these other surveillance mechanisms that are purporting to be as omnipotent as the FBI, even though that's like not even technologically possible for these enslavers, right? They're projecting that they're able to do these things, just making up maps or whatever of how ordered their worlds are.
FBI was struggling.
So I think, yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's not even just it's also about looking at what's there for what it actually is, right? How dare you say that these WPA narratives are more fraught than these court documents by these people?
Yes. I love that. I love that. I mean, it's so funny because in some ways that's part of what operationalizes the opposite for me in trying to think about null value in a lot of ways. It came out of recognizing the ways that we know that for empire to operate, for slave owners to operate, there's a heavy focus on surveillance, right? There's a constant concern on either side of the Atlantic. What are the Wolof doing? What is happening down the coast? What are the different polities doing? Where can I sow dissent between different officials? Who is gonna secure customs? We know that there's the critical panoptic surveillance of the slave ship. We know that there is now a kind of struggle for power once Africans arrived enslaved on the other side of the Atlantic. And part of that struggle is, where are spaces in which Africans can abscond as enslaved and otherwise, and where are going to be the spaces that, in this case, the French are going to claim dominion over and claim, not necessarily have, but claim absolute power over. And so all of that we know is true. And yet I came to these registers and came to these documents where all of a sudden now we're not going to count women. Now there's no children to be seen. Now we're not going to create a category or a column or a field, as we might say in DH and data, for free people of color or for mulattoes and mulats, or like different color categories. Like now all of a sudden we get nitpicky about what information we want to give. And that, in the same way as you're saying, Vanessa, where it's like people, we know about that constant surveillance, now that kind of self-conscious, but we're just going to pretend that's not there. That to me is such a critical piece that we, at least on the slavery side, we're not talking about enough when we don't have a kind of conceptualization. So that's what null value is. For me, it's a way of thinking about how do we actually hold space for what has now disappeared from sight that we know is probably there, and how do we think about what why or why not is being counted. Right? Why or why not are women or Maroons? There's no designated count of Maroons in the French period of the 18th century. Nobody does a census, but we know that people are absconding into the swamps. And that's critical knowledge, right? That's knowledge that enslaved people would have had. Women, children, Maroons, otherwise, all the various statuses. And that means if that knowledge is circulating, we now in the present day need to find a way to write into that. And so null value is an attempt, but there's other attempts, and I hope there are more attempts, because I think this is the exercise, right? Like this is the practice of figuring out how do we get into the breaks and into the cleavages of surveillance and try and create some space where even if where we abide by, imperial historical standards, that we can't say that, the evidence is there, quote unquote, the evidence is there, always that phrase. We know that there's a space of possibility for thinking into what we might understand about what is or is not being said, or what is being said that we know is false, and all of the other ways that these archives and these documents show and do not show their cards.
Hello, everyone. I'm so sorry to interject because it just feels like I'm interrupting into a, dinner party that we all have the honor to witness. But I'm just going to add some more questions that folks have added in the Q&A, and I'll add them all in the same way. And then Gabriela will put them in the chat so we can all refer to them for the next 15 minutes. So the first question that we have, the participant said, oftentimes when those of us who study Black women histories who are enslaved or domestics or migrant workers, we are confronted with the violence of the archive, which occur in place and are more intimate family and community histories. Women and children who fled abusive households, women whose names won't be on the family Bible, photo, or Dar's roll because of legacies of slavery, family violence, and etc. How can y'all's practices help us to write about those whose family or community relations cannot be verified or extensively documented, where even if they are descendants, they have no idea about their longer family histories or ancestral kinship? So that's the first question. The second question we have is, there are current Black feminist archive projects underway to document Black women's lives and work. For example, Dr. Irma McLaurin has been constructing the Black feminist archives at UMass Amherst. There seems to be an assertion that Black women should no longer be hidden figures. Do the panelists' work speak to what these contemporary projects should consider including or excluding? What might we be cautious about so that we can document Black women with care? And the final question we have is, I really want to talk about creating innovative, revolutionary work that goes against the mainstream of a discipline. Is it only possible within Africana studies, or should it be pursued and pushed in other disciplines like philosophy, for example? I'm gonna leave y'all to play with those questions for the next 15 minutes, and then I'll be back for our final question.
I can speak a little bit to sort of contemporary projects. I do a lot of not just public facing work, but now work that's collaborative with descendant communities, which is different than, than a bunch of academics getting together and deciding what the public needs from us. And there's, I think that one thing I am honing is my ear and my sort of practice, my listening practices. And I think for myself, and I saw in the Q&A, a question about interfacing with descendant communities, it's very important for me to be honest that I'm an outsider. I'm not an outsider to the Black community at large, but I'm not from Southampton County, for example, or I'm not from Lexington, Kentucky, or I'm not from Bardstown, or I don't come from racehorse people. I don't come from this, right? So that what I am clear about is that there are people with experiential knowledge that is deeper in a particular area than mine, with needs and uses for a useful past that, like, I cannot imagine because I do not have that experience, right? And so finding ways to engage in a collaborative, imaginative process around possibility and the possibility of this past is what is important in those scenarios, right? So it becomes less about this very like colonial practice of collecting and categorizing, and much more about community practices of sharing and learning, and I would argue survival, right? For me, part of the labor of survival and the part that I engage with and see myself, there are various roles to this, there are activists, there are artists, there are, right, people who I work in solidarity with, but I can't claim that that's my work, right? But for me, right, it's not just about curating and categorizing and preserving for researchers. That's not really, that's other people's ministry, but that's not my ministry, right? It is about working with descendant communities to think through, right, what is important to them. So I use the example in my presentation of what contemporary people in Southampton County are focused on when it comes to remembering this rebellion, and some of their practices still involve hiding things, and making things not accessible. And so I think that's also something that is a well-honed skill over time. I think about Alan Crawford, right? And that the story of the rebellion that survived in his family was the story of his grandmother hitting Nat Turner so hard he bled, not a story of like triumphant rebellion, right? It's the story of his grandmother's grief is the story. The other thing Alan Crawford could remember in Southampton was to the minute slave patrol schedules from memory. Like he's remembering them in the 1930s, roughly, 100 years after he was a child in Southampton County, right? So that, right, paying attention to what is remembered, because I think we can lean into like a sort of deficit thinking around silence, that like, oh, this is such a deficit for us. If there is a silence around something, that actually is it's important to pay attention to what that silence exactly is. And you can build, right? You can build out whole projects, at least in the space I'm talking about, right? Around what communities feel that they deeply need in the present.
I'll just jump in and because that kind of jogged two things for me. So working in a more contemporary moment, there's still issues of kind of back history. So taking Queen Mother More as an example, I can trace back, but so far, but a lack of records of record keeping coupled with things being lost, et cetera, means that I can't quite get to the veracity of all the stories she tells about her ancestors, including ones that were like standing up to land and people that were being lynched, and et cetera, right? But what I do know is that no matter what, she keeps telling the same stories about her ancestors. And so I think that when in the absence of having, kind of quote unquote concrete proof, that story means something to her, right? It tells her something, it forms who she is, it's how she interpreted the world around her and who she came from. So I think that, if we're talking about strategies, one may be to just say, what is the story that people tell, right? And why is that story so important about the ancestor? And be less concerned with who exactly did what, where, and when. But because really, truthfully, more so than that, what makes a person the person that you're talking about today is the stories, like Dr. Holden is saying, of what actually happened. So I think that's one strategy. And then when talking about documenting with care, this has been something that I've grappled with a lot in biography writing and Black women. Moore had complicated relationships. She was a complex person, just like we all are. And there's real questions about what to leave in and take out. And I don't have a good answer for it, but I do think it's something that I do think there are things that I will leave out that I think would be very kind of, for lack of a better word, like titillating, right? But they don't serve the story I'm trying to tell about an intellectual biography of a woman. And if she didn't want them told, I'm okay with letting that go, right? I don't need to prove that I found it, as some kind of prize. And I think that kind of discretion is okay. And in terms of care as well, I mentioned that there's no collected archive, but that doesn't mean I have not found kind of archival artifacts that would constitute her life. And I mentioned that her son and her grandchildren have nothing. One of the things they said they wanted were like the bangles that said, for example, that woman was wearing, right? So there's ways in which I connected them with that woman to see, right? And try to restore that way. And anything that I find, I go and meet with them about once a year and give them all of it, right? Because it's their family and their legacy. And we sit through and review it and we talk about it. And, maybe it will enter into some kind of quote unquote formal archive at some point. But I do think that kind of returning quote unquote these things or offering these things up to communities and descendants is another way to work with them as you kind of write these histories.
I am thinking a lot about the question about family histories and kinship and the one about Black feminist archives. Because for me, I think they're very much related. And I'm thinking about the question about family histories and kinships, and I want to lean into the ways that there are really painful histories and memories that are not necessarily discussed or on the surface within communities or within families, but that then come across our paths as historians, researchers, scholars, for various reasons, because we're in the archive, because that's what we find. And what our responsibility is to tell or not to tell. I'm thinking with what Dr. Holden was saying about, like what, about silence, and the not told stories and dissemblance, and thinking about how serious dissemblance is as a politics, right? And as a way of navigating the world. And it's not, it is the issue is violence, right? Like, it's not just dissemblance because, respectability says, I don't want to talk about that. If only it were that easy, because that's already messy enough. It's actually about protection from violence. And so for me, I find that, I don't find talking about respectability politics as a kind of thing that is anathema. I think that it is a thing that, like many things about us, Black people, Black women, and women identified folks in particular, I find fascinating, because it is part of our creativity in navigating the astronomical levels and weight of terror against us, right? And so in that, and that is some of what I think I hear in that question, is like, what is the balance there? And what is the balance when the histories that we're writing, come up against that technology of surviving? And what is the balance when, and what do we do there? And in my case, it's been an interesting sort of map to trod, right? I think that there, for example, Wicked Flesh is, and my research in it is very much about enslaved Africans and women of African descent. It is not a Creole history of Louisiana, right? I am not of Louisiana descent. I do not have Creole placements. And so it is very explicitly not entering into that history, that story, that community knowledge of what it means to be Creole. It offers an archive of resources that can be taken up in a whole host of directions, including by that descendant community. But it's not part of that. It is not a charge to argue anything about that conversation, because that's not my conversation to have. That's my conversation to listen to. And I think that, like, that as an example is really important for us to kind of grapple with. I think there's ways well, I'm not going to go another screed about the Academy. You guys got me on one. We won't do 2 or 3. But what I'll say is this. So I think that's an example. I mean, I think there are ways that there are stories that we tell, and then there are stories that we just came across and that ended up in our laps through interviews, through text, through family stories, diaries, whatever they might be. And maybe they're not supposed to be told. And I think that is really important to kind of lean into. This is coming up in part, I think it does connect to the technology piece. So one of the projects I'd mentioned earlier is Keywords for Black Louisiana. It's Life Closures Humanities Against Enclosure project. It's actually several sub-projects, but one of them recently received a NHPRC planning grant for digital editions in order to digitize and create a digital edition of enslaved and free people of African descent in the colonial documents, which, for those who don't know, are in French and Spanish, are paleographic, which essentially means they're manuscript documents that are already difficult to read. There is no broad index of them, although they are available online in database format at lacolonialdocs.org. So anybody can go in there and look up any of the documents that are cited in mine and other people's sources. And this is a barrier to access. And we're finding, like, we knew, like, as a team, we knew this was a barrier to access, which is why we pitched to do the edition, but we're coming up across interesting barriers in a whole host of ways, like who has French and Spanish written and who can read and write French and Spanish well enough to be able to transcribe documents. It's a segregated boundary. Not a lot of Black folks on the Gulf Coast can necessarily, and a whole lot of white people can. And so what are the ways that, like, we are thinking about the kind of presumed and not presumed barriers to access as we're kind of building out various kinds of projects, Black feminist projects and otherwise. But what are the other ways that we also sort of challenge the assumptions behind those projects, and whether that is the project itself and its relationship to community, whether that's who is working on the projects, and like seeing these projects as also existing in the world of communities and labor, you know? So we've been lucky to bring on folks who are in the Gulf Coast area, some of the descendant community, some not. We've been lucky to bring on Black scholars, Black researchers. This has been something that we're very excited about. It's also been a deliberate push. Nobody told us to do that. And so I think those things also align in really powerful ways. And the last thing I'll say is that for me, the actual intellectual endeavor is how are digital projects, digital humanities, in some ways goes to one of the earlier questions as well, how are those also, just their very composition, also aligned, right? You know, so this digital edition is not a project for scholars necessarily. We hope that scholars will use it, but we're building it out and designing it in a way, or our plan, this is a planning grant, our plan is to build it out and design it in a way that it is of interest and accessible to folks who are doing history on the ground, right? Who are tour guides, who are genealogists, who are in historical societies or representing historical societies, who are at the HBCUs, who are working K-12 spaces. Like, this has been the push from the very beginning. And so I think there's so many layers there, I guess, is sort of what I'm trying to say, but it requires us to really unseat the assumptions that we already have, both about how a project is construed, but at the end of the day, the assumption that we have about our authority as academics. Like, that has to be completely sort of set aside and set to the back, because we are not the authority when it comes to community knowledge. Like, the community is authority over that knowledge, and they deserve to be in the driver's seat about how and where and what happens with those stories that are told.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism wants us to be proprietary about our work, our sources, the push, right? And like, just think how grimy that is to decide that you somehow own the documentary history of slavery. Like, yeah, we already are dealing with layers of commodification there, right? And so walking into a project without a proprietary mindset, right? It takes unlearning, right? Because you are trained to think in proprietary ways, to think away from collaborative work, to think about staking my intervention. But I'm very clear that I do not own this history. I do not own these sources. I do not own the legacy of this community, right? And I'm not even here giving voices to people. These people have their own voices, and people in Southampton County right now are doing incredible work to preserve their local history. So this is not, and that takes a lot of unlearning and pushing back. And you will be advised against it at every turn, at least within the bounds of the academy. But those aren't the storytellers I was raised by, right? Like that's not how I have home training. I was not raised that way. So I will not be running around pulling some kind of colonial collecting project on other Black and brown people for my advancement. That's really not my work to do. I want to say, I see this question about innovative revolutionary work.
But can we sit with that? Because I don't think we say that enough within us as Black scholars. Because I think sometimes we are like, oh, hey, like, we're all Black, we can do this. We can disabuse ourselves of that right now. Like, we really, really have to.
Yeah, like, nope. I absolutely do not own the archive of slavery. I do not own the minute books. I do not own that history. That is not mine to own, and I'm not here to be proprietary about it. I do want to say, though, and speak to question number 3 a little bit, that if there's one thing I have learned from the women that I work on, right, is that you need to be very savvy. It is very easy to die for the revolution. That is actually not a hard thing to do. All of us work in contexts where Black death is everywhere. people will take the finite resource of your time, right, and surveil you in return, and right, seek to make a version of you hyper visible if they can, right? So I want to be very clear, I can speak from my own experience, that to enter into the brick and mortar archive, in a more literal sense, right, was its own series of battles. I walked past Stonewall Jackson every day. I walk past the Daughters of the Confederacy every day. And every Wednesday, the same security guard denied me entrance to a fellows seminar every Wednesday. And it took the Black receptionist walking up to him and telling him every Wednesday for months to let me in for that to happen. And then another Black woman who was there vacuuming every Wednesday morning to walk me up on the elevator, because they didn't want me to wander into the galleries unattended, right? Right. So that stuff, it doesn't matter what, thing you have before or after your name, it doesn't matter, right? And the folks who worked at that particular archive also checked up on me frequently because they knew, right? They knew what the stakes were. So, Ashley, when you said, oh, well, maybe for you, this could be, and I understand, you work with alive people, which is its own tangled web of an archive as living folks. But there is a way in which folks still call it, the rebellion, like it happened last weekend, not 190 years ago. And the stakes about this, right? Right, the stakes of talking about these things, just talking about them, just mentioning you might be thinking about looking up something about them, right? There are stakes there. So be clear, right? You can't just traipse into the transgressive game, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing about being transgressive.
I think in that subject of
you.
being clear, I want to offer, and I'm gonna say excuse me because my mom also gave me home training. Oh, excuse me. I want to offer the final questions before we close out. In that subject of the folks that looked out after you and thinking about not gatekeeping academia and this material not being ours, there are a handful of scholars and seasoned professors and scholars joining us this afternoon and that have been here, that left. We also have a few graduate students and perhaps some independent scholars and prospective students in the audience. So our final set of questions before my colleague Crystal comes back to close us out are on the subject of care. How do you all make space to care for yourselves as you care for and look after Black women in the archives, especially if they appear in violent ways? And as Dr. Holden, you're saying, if you're being policed as you're trying to care for them. And finally, you've all graciously offered multiple nuggets of advice all throughout. I've been writing notes furiously, but would like to ask if there are any final pieces of advice that you would like to offer to developing scholars on approaching the archive rebelliously, whose work centers the experiences of various marginalized groups and who are learning new ways of ethically researching across disciplines. And when that time has come for the closing remarks, my colleague Crystal will join y'all.
Sorry, I'm distracted by this comment that home training is a political practice of care.
I can do the self-care one. Can I do the self-care one? I have a spiritual practice. I have a sacred and a profane practice, one and the other. This work for me is and it doesn't have to be that for everybody, just is for me, it's like calling. And it's a sacred calling. And it is ancestor work. I regard it as ancestor work, the work in histories of slavery. So I have a sacred practice that includes everything from meditation and prayer to altars and all kinds of things. So I think that having a spiritual practice, whatever that may be, it could be anything, it does not matter, is incredibly important for those of us who are doing histories of slavery. I suspect it's important across the board, but I think I don't think I know a scholar of a Black woman scholar of slavery doesn't have some kind of ritual for interfacing with the ancestral plane. And I think that for me has been everything. I also have a profane practice in which it is critical to remain in my own flesh and in my own body in a whole host of ways. And that's everything from high femme presentation to, what I do at night when the bedroom door is closed. It's none of your business. But, but I share it now because having a profane practice is also incredibly important for those of us who are investigating gender and sexuality. It is really important that we remember that for all our theorization, and I love some theory. I started with Spillers in this talk here in my remarks, that people remain in their bodies and had to navigate these worlds within their bodies and had to return to them somehow. And how do we figure out what that is if we are not also practicing that? And so whatever that might mean for you and for your communities, it is something that I strongly suggest cultivating early and then maintaining it as best you can as things happen, maintaining it as best you can throughout the thinky processes that we engage in this academic space.
I've watched, and I think in this moment of collective grief, in a sort of just like a mass grievous event that is the pandemic, but is also the various conditions of Black life that are apparent. I've watched time and time again the ways in which this, not just the academy, but the world we live in is trying to kill people like me daily. Right? That's very real in the present. I do not need to go back to slavery times to walk through that particular geography. So cultivating life and joy are things you can do. Dr. Johnson suggests various kinds of practices, but I'm very clear that survival is a type of labor. It's feminized labor in a lot of ways. It is a type of labor. And I endeavored very early on that while there were many things that were out to get me, it wasn't going to be this that was going to be the thing that got me. Too many things in this world that could get me for this to be it. And I think that can be very hard, particularly when you're doing in the middle of graduate study, right, to separate that out, right, and to make very clear stands. But in some ways, one of the most transgressive things you can do isn't even about, right, the content of the work, right? It is preserving yourself so that you will be here to finish it. So that you will be here to see it. Because there are too many folks whose shoulders I'm standing on who should be here. And they are one of the reasons we have to interface with the ancestral plane is because too many of us are ancestors well before our counterparts in other communities become ancestors. And for me, part of honoring those people that I come from, part of the ways that I seek to honor them and what I do isn't just about work. Because I know, my great-grandmother's dreams were not dreams of work. That wasn't what she was dreaming about. She worked real hard so that I would not have to work sun up to sundown like she did. So I like to keep that in mind. She's behind me on my makeshift altar, right, to remind me of that. And sometimes I got to get clear, I'm not saying it's not, people on this very call who have had to yoke me up about that, but it is a constant. I'm not naming names, you know, that's for the after the webinar. Exclusive.
I love that you said that, because when they asked about self-care, I was like, I sit still and I do nothing, right? Like I rest. I sit very still, I drink my water and I do nothing. And but one of the things that academia and this job will have you thinking is that you don't deserve rest, right? And that to do so is to put you at a deficit in some way. And I think that's in large part why we have, I mean, gosh, in the last year alone, right? So many of our Black women kind of ideologues and figureheads, right? It will constantly be taking from you. And I feel like the work that I do on More and Others rejuvenates me. But either way, my mind and my body needs rest in order to do that, to see clearly, to think expansively, right? To think imaginatively. I can't do that in a state of continual exhaustion all the time. And my work deserves better than my continual exhaustion all the time when I come to it, right? And so, you know, I think that we just need to also cultivate a practice of rest and that being okay. And that also means that it means giving your colleagues another space to rest themselves, like not demanding so much of them and taking when they say, I'm at my limit and I need to put something down, to let them do that, right? To make that space to rest, I think is really, really important as we go forward. So I'll just add in a plug for sitting still.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. I'm Crystal, and I'll be delivering our closing remarks. Thank you to our marvelous panelists, Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson, Dr. Vanessa Holden, and Dr. Ashley Farmer, for such an exhilarating and refreshing program. Your stimulating presentations and thoughts on the rebellious acts of Black women and archival methodologies have left us all with such a powerful offering, which I am certain many of us will carry over into our own research and our scholarship. As many of us head back to our classrooms, lecture halls, libraries, and physical and digital archives, our ears and eyes will be more attuned to hear and discern the silent histories of various marginalized groups. We carry with us the new and exciting ways in which your scholarship is working to reframe what it means for Black people, and more specifically Black women, to rebel. We will carry with us words like revolution, community, intimacy, kinship, freedom, womanhood, and Black power, as we continue to think about the many forms that Black women's rebellion took throughout the history of the African diaspora. Hopefully, the greatest takeaway from today's conversation will be the reminder that not just historians, but scholars from every discipline, such as sociology, English, anthropology, performance studies, philosophy, ethnomusicology, and art history, can embrace the idea of approaching the archive and their scholarship rebelliously. Thank you again for this gift. Thank you to everyone that was able to join us today, both from Penn and beyond. We apologize that we may not have gotten to all of your questions. However, just as lives are lived within and beyond the Academy, so will this conversation beyond the Zoom grid. To do so, to follow up with Dr. Johnson, Dr. Holden, and Dr. Farmer, we ask that you support them by following them on Twitter, and also reading and purchasing their books. And finally, thank you to the Department of Africana Studies, specifically Sean, Ms. Carroll, and Dr. Williams for supporting us in this process, and the fantastic Africana Graduate Colloquium Committee for making this happen. If you would like to find more events hosted by the Africana Studies Department and the Center for Africana Studies, the center will be hosting an event that is part of their New Directions and Afro-Latinx Study Series on Zoom on March 29th at 5:30 p.m. titled Cartographies of Afro-Latinidad, Limits and Possibilities with Dr. Amalia Z. Dashe. You may subscribe to Africana Studies mailing lists, register for this event and others at africana.sas.upenn.edu. You may also find us on Instagram at Africana UPenn and on YouTube at UPenn Africana. We hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend, and thank you again to our panelists.